My gosh, we're trying to convince him to go.
Chris, stop talking.
Are we going or is this a test?
We're going.
This is it, baby.
Oh shit. Alright, hang on. Well, hey everybody, it's Zero Reserve, rocking your daily commute. Tonight we've got Double A Jess and the Mongoose, and our special guest Trey. Say hey, Trey.
Hey.
Welcome
Trey.
to episode 3.
Our music ran out. I didn't realize.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this is for
he took
all
too
those
long.
listeners that still have a daily commute.
You have to lean into the radio aspect of.
I know. I'm just saying, literally, no one's commuting to work anymore. Everybody's working from home.
Pff, I wish. But I also am like 3 minutes away from my work, so I guess I can't complain.
Well, that's nice.
Alrighty. Well, this is episode 3 of Zero Reserve. I'm your host today, Alex Black. Joining me on the episode is the Mongoose. What's up, Mongoose? Do mongooses howl?
Yes,
They
that a
do not.
mongoose?
I don't think
They do
so.
not. But that does not matter right now.
What about a mongoose with coronavirus? Does a mongoose with coronavirus howl?
It sounds more like.
Also on the cast today, we've got Jess. How's it going, Jess?
Good.
And as well, the Cal himself. How's it going, Alejandro?
Yeah, good.
We're really leaning into this already. And finally, our special guest on this episode is Trey Alsup. Thanks for coming on, Trey. We really appreciate it. How are you?
It's my pleasure, and I'm showing no symptoms whatsoever, so I'm ready to do this
Good.
podcast.
I think hopefully none of us are showing symptoms. But yeah, so we've got a special episode for you today. We are going to discuss Thrones War draft strategy. Some of you perhaps have already heard Trey's beautiful voice on the Second Sons. May they rest in peace. Analyzing some draft strategy from Thrones War UK 2018 or 2019. I think it was 2019. Is that right, Trey?
I've done it a couple times.
Couple times? Okay, yeah.
Done it a couple
You've kind of
times.
become known as like the draft strategy guy, more or less. So we thought we'd bring you in here and basically, run it back, see if there's any new updates on your perspective of how to approach the draft and all that. Plus, we've got two. What are we calling it? Thrones War Prime now, or what do we have? What is the name for the San Diego Thrones War variant these days?
I'm pretty sure people call it Prime or OG.
Thrones War Corona Vacation.
Jesus Christ, it's CT. So we've got two regents, two soon to be regents. Some. I think, is this your first time being a regent, CT and Jess, at Thrones War Prime? There's been so many of them now that they kind of mix together for me.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So
This is
we
my
got
first non-hand experience.
two first timers for the Thrones War Prime event. I know you've both been regents at other Prime events, and then we also have someone who I presume will be one of the most sought after commodities in the player pool in Alejandro, and then there's me. And right now I'm like solidly on the fence. Tickets are really cheap, and I'm not sure. So basically, the entire point of this podcast is that you guys got to sell me on going to this year's Thrones War. So at the end of the podcast, I'll decide if I'm going or not. So that's a lot. I hope you guys are ready for. That's not too much pressure for you.
It's a lot of
Anyway,
pressure.
so
Well, I'm
So
confused
Trey-
now. Is the
Keep
Thrones Prime War Prime event, is that the San Diego event, or?
that is
Yes.
correct. Yeah, I'm just trying. I want to get the nomenclature right. I'm not sure what everybody. We can just call it Thrones War from here on in. I'm fine with that. It's the original after all. But I don't want people to confuse it with the UK Thrones War, which had a draft a few weeks back and is going to happen I assume in a few weeks from now. I'm not sure when the actual date of that event
It's the
is.
same weekend.
It's
as
the
Thrones.
exact same
Yeah.
weekend. Wow,
is,
well
yeah.
that's pretty big actually.
So they did the draft really early then.
Yeah, they've got a ton of time to prepare.
Yep.
Yeah, and they're doing the world's meta, so
Right. Yeah,
Right.
which we
That's the
will
big
definitely get
difference.
into. Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge difference. So I wanted to start off, Trey, by asking. I'll ask these questions to everyone, but I want to ask them to you first, because you're our special guest. If you were in CT or Jess's position, and you were going to be a first time regent, ignoring the fact that they've been regents at other war events, how would you begin to prepare for your first time being a regent?
Well, I would say. So we're talking about preparation for the draft itself.
Yeah, I should say. I'm sorry. Yeah, we should
Sure.
clarify for the
So
draft. Yes.
So I think the main things they should be looking at right now is they should be making a bunch of calls. The first call is going to be looking at the player list and ranking all of those players in terms of desirability for you personally. It's important. I know some people kind of do tiers, but it's helpful to actually kind of like go ahead, let's rank all of these people, 1 to 64, so that you can then assign a dollar value to them going into the auction, and you can track during the auction whether you think people are going at discounts or whether people are going too high, so that you can kind of just take the temperature of the auction as you're going and manage your money in a really smart way. So one is just like make those calls in terms of player evaluations. That's a really big topic that I know almost nothing about. Like I don't, yeah, I've played some events. I have opinions about players, but I don't think that like my opinions on players would be any more valuable than anyone else, and probably less so.
So that's a fairly large variable factor, in terms of like skill of a regent in being able to, make those determinations on the player pool.
Absolutely. And like
Okay.
this is an area that I think like Buzz would have a lot to say on this, because like I think both he and James love going into Jousting Pavilion and looking at tournament results and trying to like feed all of that data into a spreadsheet and then come up with a ranking based upon win percentage and this type of stuff to actually like apply some data to ranking players in terms of their expected performance. And I've never done that. um, but in the end though, like you kind of need to just get to who do I think's the best player, and then who are the players who are probably the least desirable. And it's important to rank all of them, because that's going to help you assign dollar values to the entire pool, so that you can like, because there's a different skill between I'm going to put together a good team but knowing what to pay for people, that's a whole different thing. And this is where hopefully I can provide some insight. So
Absolutely.
that would be one. The second thing would, and what's going to be super interesting, I think, going into this Thrones War, is you got to make some big time meta calls about house value. I think you gotta look. You need, whether you're already testing using the restricted list that the Regents and Chris came up with. You got to make some pretty big calls now about what houses you think are most desirable, how much better they are, and even like what do I think is like the worst house, what the worst house is, um, and ranking all of those things. If you're going to assign some values to it, you need to do that. And it's important to do each one, and it may even be important to figure out it's important to figure out how much worse some of these other factions are. So I hope we can kind of get into some people's thoughts about different factions right now. I don't want regents to have to like show their hands, but we can kind of go through the exercise of like, how do we assign a value to a faction in these formats based upon how well you think they're going to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I fully intend on trying to delve into some of that, on this episode. Is there anything else that's sort of like an overarching idea, that you would be looking at going into prep? I mean, you've talked obviously about ranking the player pool and then ranking the houses, is there a third element there that you really want to have in your toolbox as you prepare for your first time ever drafting, or would you say those are the two main things?
I think those are the two main things, but maybe the third category we would just call draft strategy / tips of, maybe 6 to 8 rules that we're probably all at this point fairly familiar with about how to conduct your draft, um, in order to not make some of the classic blunders of Thrones War
Sure.
drafting. Things like, save $2 for every single player. Don't be the last one to get a faction. Things like that.
Right.
That
So
we
does
can get to
anybody?
later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Does anybody else have anything to add on sort of that question of, you two have experience, CT and Jess, obviously in other events, but if you were going into this and just this was your first time being a regent, um, what would you tell yourself if this was your first time? Like something you would want to know before you started any of the preparatory process, um, that initial time. I guess CT, do you want to answer that one first?
Sure. So like one thing that never ceases to amaze me about Thrones War is we do a lot of these now every year, and the player counts. Therefore, the budgets fluctuate pretty wildly at this point.
Yep.
And it seems like no matter how much that changes, people don't change that people don't adjust their like costs for players or houses. And that's kind of terrifying to me on some regard. Like this is going to be the first one in a while where the budgets are $70, right?
Depends on how many people sign up today, right?
Right. But
If
we're
Alex signs
anticipating
up,
70.
you would have a bigger budget.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
All the numbers will change. Could be.
I think
true.
we're already there.
That's
You
true.
think we cracked 48?
Yes.
Yes,
Good.
I
Yeah.
believe the current count is 58, maybe 57. So I think they're trying to make a push for 64.
Yeah, 57 sounds right. Yeah.
57. Okay.
But I definitely
as-
feel like there's a pattern of people still bidding like they have $130, but like they don't have that much money. So the thing I would definitely tell anybody doing this for the first time is like, do not get caught up in the crazy bid wars. Like when Tar goes up to $45, half your money in the first 5 seconds of the house going up. No matter how bad you want Targ, like don't just jump on it. Like you need to actually take the time to consider how much money you have total, and if that is like these normal crazy bidding patterns may not line up for success.
And I imagine we will dive into that idea specifically later on. But I think what's important to remember is that it's all contextual, and that you should have a value that is set for the house based on the context of your budget. And people definitely need to adjust based on budget size, and that is one of the big variables in these is the budgets aren't always the same. So yeah, that's definitely a really good point. Jess, do you have anything that you would have told yourself before your first time being a regent? I believe you were the Laney regent out at Thronestoberfest last. Is that correct?
It was 2 Thronestoberfest ago. Yep.
Gotcha.
I would probably say I think the biggest thing is don't put up anything you desperately want. Because I feel like
that's interesting. Yeah.
if you throw up a house you really want or a player you really want and then you continuously bid on it, that's how I think those bidding wars get started, because they're like, oh, she really wants, X thing.
That's a really interesting idea. I do want to unpack that, but perhaps we'll leave that to a little later, because I think we might have some differences of opinions on that potentially. But it's one of those things that it's really hard to know. That's one of those things that I think it's not super easily sort of equatable to like from a math standpoint. Is this correct or not? And more of like a game theory type question. So.
Yeah, Jess is talking about timing, and
Right,
like there's going to be
absolutely.
a right time and a wrong time to make the move on the stuff you actually want. And I think like being prepared and having assigned values to stuff before the draft can help you identify, like, what's one of the main things that like being prepared can do is it will cue you in for when the time is right to make those moves.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, forgive me, Alejandro. Have you ever been a regent at one of these events? You have, right?
I have,
No,
yeah.
you have. You
Yeah,
were at
yeah.
Thrones War, right, last year?
Yeah,
Okay.
and like 3 years ago or something.
Okay, so we can extend the question to you as well. Is there anything that you'd like to tell yourself before going into those events if you had the opportunity?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I don't disagree with Jess's point because I think early on you mostly want to get the other regions, um, you know, their money down. But one thing that I made the mistake of, um, probably over both of them actually, was that like there's a part, and Trey touched on this already. There's a part of the draft where you want to start getting stuff, and the way that you do that is by putting them up yourself. So um it's more mid-tier stuff that you want to do
Mm-hmm.
this for. um it's not the high end stuff, but there's certainly a point where it shifts and you like need to start grabbing the things that you want before there's not a lot left and everybody's fighting over scraps,
Right. Yeah. If
which
you wait
maybe
too
that's not a
long,
great.
if you no, I think that's a good point. If you wait too long to nominate, maybe um this like dark horse pick or this sleeper pick that you want to make, and everyone's left desperate for good picks, then your dark horse or sleeper pick is going to end up costing you way more than you wanted. Whereas if you nominated them in the mid portion of the draft, perhaps you could have gotten a great deal. So I think that's a really interesting point, and we'll dive into that a little more later. For now, I wanted to focus on the idea of valuations for houses. So Trey, what's the best way to determine expected values for houses in a brand new format like we have for Thrones War this year?
All right. So like everything that's in the spreadsheets that I put together is about like what do you get for a dollar? Like that's kind of like the cornerstone of all valuation for rotisserie baseball or any of these games where you're assigning a dollar value to something is that um, you want to say you don't want to necessarily assign a you don't want to, for example, be paying a certain number of dollars per win that you expect a player to get. You want to pay for those things that you don't get for free. And so like for players, for example, even the players that are we would rank the lowest, players like me in the tournament, like you might have a win expectancy of like that you would go 2 and 5 or maybe 2.5 and 4.5. It's okay to break it up. um, but I'm still a $1 player. Like if I'm going to get 2 wins or 3 wins, you don't want to pay $7 or $8 for me because you're going to normally pay $3 or $4 per win. Like the right price for a player like me is $1 or $2. If you're expecting 2 or 3 wins out of me, so in a sense you have to kind of like ignore the first 2 wins that happen. So that's on the player side. On the house side, you want to look at each faction and make a numeric call about once I've ranked all of the houses 1 to 8, it isn't enough just to go, this is my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You want to say, um, how many win if I'm an average, if you take an average player and they're playing an average house, like that's 0. And then if I'm looking at the best house, and let's just say hypothetically using 2019 meta, not the current meta, and said, okay, Targaryen, playing Targaryen, what's that going to add to an average player? Does their win expectancy go up from 3.5 wins to 4 wins, or is it going up, a full win where we would expect that average player now to get 4.5 wins in this format when they're playing Targ? And on the other side, let's say again 2019 meta, what's the worst house? Is every single player dropping half a win by playing Bara or more? And if you can actually like try to put a number on that, that actually helps you then say, okay, when I buy Targ and they're giving me 0.6 wins above average. And with my players, like there's 9 people on my team plus the regent, so that's 10 players. They're giving me 0.6 wins per player. So Targ is contributing 6 wins above 6 wins total, just by buying that house above the average. And then say Bera was kind of doing the same on the opposite. So we have a 12 win spread between the top house and the bottom house. Then you can start to say, okay, so Targaryen I should pay for those 12 wins for Targaryen above Baratheon. And that's why you can see like a value on a house be justified for being well beyond what a top player would get, because there's no player in this game that's giving you 12 wins.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting concept. And so my question would be, if we look back at like old Thrones War events, perhaps, where we had these like dominant top houses, such as Targaryen from last year, if Targ is boosting every player 0.6 wins per player, how does that translate to you in terms of what percentage of your budget you are willing to spend on that house?
Right. So what I would say is, like, part of the meta call that regents are going to make right now is just looking at those houses and saying how close are they to each other. The larger that spread is, the more budget should be allocated towards houses. If the houses are very competitive with each other, like say hypothetically that this Thrones War restricted list was pure genius, and all 8 houses are now perfectly equal strength, and we have this fantastic balanced meta, the correct price to pay for a house is $1, right? Like if all of the houses were completely balanced, you wouldn't devote any of your anything more than the minimum towards it. So the bigger that spread, the more percentage of your budget you should be allocating.
Right. So when people spend X amount of money on a house, it that implication is preference, as well as obviously how much better they think that house is than the average house in the field per se. So
Yeah, I would say
so
it's not really the average house, it's against the worst house. I know that's
okay, sure.
quibbling, but in a sense
No, no, no.
the worst house determines the market,
Okay.
if that
All
makes
right. I
sense.
think that's a really good way of looking at that. So CT, Jess, Alejandro, you guys have all been regents. Some of you are going to be regents again. Where do you think, knowing that and your strategies for evaluating houses, because I know there's been sort of a prevailing belief, at least in American Thrones War draft strategy, where you don't want to be the person stuck at the very end paying $1, but you also don't want to be the person who overpays for the house. And what Trey is kind of saying is, from what I'm hearing, is that's not necessarily correct. Like it's sometimes okay to pay the most for a house, because the house is what ultimately you can have the most equity in. Like the house can give you the most extra wins. So is that something that, knowing that, is that something that really changes your approach to the upcoming draft? Jess, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, so with my Thrones Toberfest team, I actually took the $1 house. Well, there was 2 $1 houses, but I took one of them and we came in second because I prioritized getting really good players on my team. And it's just, I can see both sides of it, I guess. I think it just depends on how, I guess, how balanced the pool is of players. If there's a high concentration of good players, I don't think it's as bad to take the $1 house.
Let
So
me ask
do
you a
you?
question.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So
Mhm.
when you were in the draft doing this and you got your house for $1,
Yeah.
did you think it was the worst house?
No.
Right. So you made some profit. Like you
Yeah.
thought you had some profit immediately when you got it for $1.
Yes.
Okay. What? And out of curiosity, what would you have been willing to pay for that house?
Um, probably like $5.
Okay. So you made a little bit of profit. You also knew you were gonna. How early did you get your house?
I got it. It was the last two houses. What were the? It was
So
the
you were
other
just
$1
building a
house
good
was there.
team. You weren't building a team based upon house, or did you think you were going to end up on the house that you ended up on?
I knew I was probably going to be at that house. It
It
was
was
kind of a
definitely a gambit. I remember because I worked with Jess on prep for that draft, and a lot of it was drafting towards Lannister, like
yeah,
getting players who were comfortable with Lannister. So it was definitely a gambit in that if it didn't pay off, you might have been in some trouble,
yeah.
but it did pay off. So
Yeah, I'm definitely not telling you that you have to take the most expensive
No,
house.
yeah,
It sounded like you made a lot of profit just on your house selection, so
yeah,
yeah, it's
that's great.
possible that even though you would have paid 5 for Lannister, that the value of it in the draft should have been even higher than that. I mean, it probably should have been, maybe I'm just throwing a number out there, but like,
yeah.
10 or
I mean,
11 or something like that.
essentially, it was like Vac and I didn't have houses, and he's like, I want Barra. Like, you can have Lannister. Just don't bid me up on Barra. And I was like thinking, that's great. I think Barra's the worst house.
Hmm.
Oh,
So
the wild west of
yes.
Throneswar. Thronetoberfest is just like no rules, no holds barred.
yeah. But I mean, I don't necessarily believe that strategy would work for this Thrones War because I think the player pool is just way too small.
Right. So, and why don't we apply some of these things to the upcoming Thrones War? So we've got a brand new restricted list.
Yeah.
We've got a bunch of new cards that are getting injected into the format. If somebody wants to help me by pulling that restricted list up, so that we can reference it, that would be awesome. So it's going to be really difficult to say with any sort of certainty, you know, what is the gap between the best house and the worst house here, because we don't have any data on this meta game and tournament results. It would be very easy, in my opinion, to sort of be overstimulated by all this new, like these new cards, like cards that are now being restricted, and all the cards that are the influx of cards coming in. I mean, you could maybe compare it to a Thrones War in the past where a box came out right before the Thrones War. I think that wasn't super uncommon for the original Thrones Wars that happened in February. But usually the boxes have been out for a couple months. So, um, does anybody have any insight on how they're sort of approaching this process? Perhaps Alejandro, you're not going to be a regent for this event, but do you have any insight on how you would evaluate these houses with all this new, all this new these new cards that are going to be played?
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to talk about the rankings of the factions, or
We could, but I'm more interested in like the disparity between the top and the bottom house. If because we've been specifically talking about sort of how that
right? Yeah,
how that impacts how much of someone's budget they're willing to spend on a house, is like the disparity between the top and bottom.
yeah. I mean, Trey's talked about this. And this is one of the most important parts of the draft to figure out, right? Um, and it's actually really difficult when there's a restricted list that gets dropped right before it. Um, and you like as a regent, I think this might be the most profit you could have made in any of the wars to date. It's hard for me to think back at something that changed the meta as much as this list has, and the pack. Um, and so if a regent has done their homework and figured out exactly what the prices should be, or how bad the worst one is, how good the best one is, and what the separation is. Um, they can gain a lot of equity there. I think the way that I look at it, there's probably a lot, not as much as last year, um, because the difference between Para and Targ was so steep last year. But I think that there's a significant amount of difference. However, I do think that there's a few at the top that are pretty close to each other. Then there's like a middle pack, and then there's one or two at the very bottom. So I think the disparity is pretty large, but there's a few factions that you can get, and I think you would be happy with. Um, but it's hard for me to get like any deeper than that because I've just been building some decks and theory crafting stuff. I haven't had any reps in the meta. I've taken like decks that I built with the restricted list and played on One Iron Throne. Um,
Well, Alejandro,
Sure.
but
you're acting like a regent here, where you're holding your cards pretty close to your chest still.
well, it's. Oh, do you want to like know the factions? I guess
Well, we could go into speculation, but I think, is it possible that with so many new cards being printed, a lot of them, the power level of which is very strong, it's really going to be more a factor of, are the regents that end up with these factions going to be able to take advantage of the fact that they just got this big shot in the arm? Because I can guarantee you that not every regent will be able to do that. It's not
Mm-hmm.
going to be this equivalent thing where everybody figures out how to use these cards to the best, to their utmost potential. So, do we think that the fact that pretty much every faction outside of arguably Night's Watch, and even then, there's a lot of really good neutral cards that have been put into the pool, right? Um, is it gonna be too much of a guessing game and too much of a who discovers the atom bomb type thing? And is that going to push the disparity of the two of the houses together, and sort of, that's what I'm curious about, because there is so much, like, there's so much there's so many cards that are being added that I think are just going to be auto includes. And then there's also going to be some cards that, if people figure out how to abuse them, are really going to elevate these factions. And so that's why putting the evaluation on the houses is so difficult right now. I don't know.
yeah, a lot of moving
Seats,
pieces.
right? Yeah. So I guess that would be my question: is there is it possible that there's so much good stuff being put into the format that it creates a smaller disparity between the houses? CT, what do you think about that concept?
So here's my hot take. I think people are overvaluing the new cards being put into the card pool. So Windy City was last weekend, and Windy City basically had 6 restricted cards in the there were 6 specific cards you couldn't play with. But other than that, people basically got to play whatever they wanted from the new pack, which there was a nice, pretty even spread of house representation. And you can basically just assume that like every house had 3 new supposedly busted cards that they could play with. And at the end of the day, even though there were a lot of really crazy, wild games and like wacky interactions, everything lost to Targ Sea of Blood. So I don't think that the discrepancy from this restricted list is like wildly far away from where we were with the war meta. Other than there was a lot of clear Martell favoritism in this restricted list. So they're definitely going to jump up a lot there on their end. But other than that, I don't think that the actual rankings change very drastically. I think Martell goes up quite a bit and Barra probably comes down quite a bit. But I don't think there's going to be like a huge difference just based off this card pool, because this is a much more restrictive list than Windy City played. And I mean, look what happened there. I think that's pretty representative of like how a lot of this will go. The big swinging factor, though, is that is Lannister, because Wheels was not allowed, period. at Windy City, and whoever drafts Lannister could potentially play Wheels. So I feel like that's kind of the only really big unknown factor we have as far as any like raw tournament data with these cards.
And as much as any of these cards could be considered an atom bomb, Wheels Within Wheels has to be
Yeah, it's
on the short
it's
list
the
for
top
that.
one for sure. Yeah.
Yep.
As far as house discrepancy, I still think your Targs and your Lannies are probably still very very much on top. And I think that your Greyjoys and your Tyrells are probably still very low. And then other than Martell and Barra kind of swapping places,
So
I
do
don't
you
feel like it's
still
super different.
see you think the disparity is similar to that of the world's meta, in such that the top houses are going to be going for 30% of the budget and the bottom houses are still going to be obviously going for $1?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I don't feel like the disparity between the biggest house and the lowest house is going to be different than what we've seen before, for the most part. I still think we'll
Gotcha.
see that top house go for, $30, $35 or whatever. And then people are going to be fighting to not get a house for $1. Whatever that worst house ends up being, I think that's probably the bigger debate, is like which house is the worst now, as opposed to which house is the best. Because I do think that there's a few pretty big titans there with some of these new cards.
So there is a new wrinkle to this war that hasn't existed in the past, and that's the introduction of one agenda per player per team. So in the past, I don't know exactly like what the ratio has been, but I feel like it's usually like like
It
a
was
1
3
to
2 years ago, and
yeah. I mean, like based on the size of the teams, it's usually something like a 3-to-1 ratio, I feel like. Does that sound right? Maybe 2-to-1 at the lowest it's ever been. And so we're going from that to basically these teams of 7 or 8 people, and they're going to have to produce, instead of 4 decks or 3 decks,
right.
they're going to have to produce 7 or 8 different decks. I mean, surely that in and of itself is going to be a huge determining factor in the, not only the value of these houses, but the disparity of the top and the bottom house. Like, do we think that Targaryen has the diversity to be, the most expensive faction, or the faction that returns the most wins per player in the format? Alejandro, why don't you answer that one?
Yes, it feels like a yes to me. And I'm not sure that it's just because it was, one of the best decks at Worlds. I think it also kind of avoided some hits like Khal Drogo and Kotho being restricted, or big, obviously, for the deck that won Worlds. Um, but leaving Womb of the World available so that every deck can play Womb of the World and
Mm-hmm.
new Khal Drogo in overwhelming numbers, and take Kotho as is restricted if it really wants to. Feels like a really good place to be for them. So I think going in, Targ feels super strong.
Well, every war's always had that thing of like, it's just like Targ has efficient cards and they're easy to play. So even if Targ doesn't necessarily have like the best deck in the format at the moment, they've always performed very well.
Yep.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about our expectations for potentially the best house, or the house that's going to return the most wins per player. It's going to add the most wins per player, which might be Targaryen. If we sat here and talked for 3 hours, maybe we'd come up with a different answer. Maybe it's Lannister. What about the
Yeah,
worst?
I still think that there's a lot to explore. Like,
absolutely, yeah. That's what I mean to say is I don't want to put I don't want to put a cap on that discussion. Like, we could talk about that for a long time,
yeah.
and try to figure out
And we wouldn't,
exactly.
because we need a lot of data before
Right.
we really
Yeah.
started to figure any of this out.
But since we can't do that, or since we're not going to do that, let's talk about the inverse of that, which is the worst house. Which in my mind, there are a couple houses that jump out at me, but to me, the big factor in determining that is what didn't get a boost, what didn't get a shot in the arm from this pack. And to me, the answer to that question is Night's Watch.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I think Night's Watch has traditionally been a very good war format house. So to say that my expectation is that it should be one of the cheaper houses in this field might mean that it's secretly has a lot of equity there, because it might go for, really low and again perform as Night's Watch does. And I don't know if that's due somewhat to its versatility. The fact that you can play Core Wall in any Night's Watch build and have a win condition right there. But yeah, I don't know. Trey, from a sort of an analytical perspective, and sort of seeing the success of Night's Watch throughout the years, do you think Night's Watch going for $1 in this draft would be a huge mistake?
Yeah, I don't see it going for $1. I don't know exactly where to put it. I really have no idea. I would say that it has been the most reliably profitable, house in Thrones War history, right? Like it so often goes for unsexy numbers and then
Mm-hmm.
does above that. Is this a current meta change that? I can't tell you. It doesn't sound to me like it's the worst, and I would say generally I think that regents and players have overreacted to restricted list changes. I think CT's right about that. So and I've heard from different people that felt like Target's been hitting really hard, so it shouldn't be at the top anymore. These are the kind of calls you have to make as a regent. And then the final thing I would say is I think also what CT was saying is like identifying what the worst house is may be much more important than what you think the best house is. I mean, it's important to come up with values, especially if you don't want to play certain, like some people don't want to play Greyjoy, some people don't want to play Night's Watch. Like that's important that end up with players and yourself where you're going to be happy building with with the house that you end up with, especially because like of all the Thrones Wars that I've been involved with or that I've seen, like this is the deck builder challenge, right? Like this is going to be the most, you know this is going to be a test of the team to come up with the decks in a way that exceeds previous iterations of this. But part of that means like you really have to nail down, what do I want to avoid, what's the worst house, so that I can accurately price everything else.
10 points to Gryffindor. And that's particularly a reference to this little whiteboard I have sitting in front of me that it says, go to Thrones War, don't go to Thrones War, go to Thrones War as Gryffindor, don't go to Thrones War as Slytherin. So, so interestingly,
50 points for Gryffindor.
Interestingly, we talk about Night's Watch, which is, like you said, historically one of the most profitable houses. Let's talk a little bit about Martell, which is historically
Hey, let's stay on Night's Watch for like a second.
Oh, fine.
Because here's why I think it's in the worst shape. It's losing two really big cards that have been basically a static inclusion for every one of their top builds. With this restricted list, they're losing Clytus, they're losing Return to the Fields. These are two really big hits. And if you look at the bin pack, you're basically saying Night's Watch by far got the weakest new cards and may have taken the biggest hit, which is why I think they're falling down so far. I think it's important to address like why confirmed. We think that.
CT confirmed trying to get Night's Watch for $1.
Got me.
I think that's a reasonable argument, but I think that they are probably still a very versatile house when it comes to the Thrones War format.
Sure, you're not going to have to run into like as many aggro decks, like if we're looking at it from a purely meta basis. But...
I think from that perspective alone, they should not be the cheapest house. Even if they did take a significant bump and they're not really getting a shot in the arm that other factions aren't getting. I mean, because obviously they're still getting all the neutrals and the new agendas,
right?
But nothing to separate themselves really from the other factions. And part of that is that a lot of these are 1.0 reprints, quote unquote. So, they really phoned it in as far as the Night's Watch cards in the bin pack. But
and plus people may just not want to play with the Sam because it's so goddamn ugly. Even though
I
that card
guess-
is probably fairly okay in like any Night's Watch deck.
Yeah, I guess that has a greater than 0 value.
I think it
So
does.
so Night's Watch historically most profitable house. Martell historically the least profitable. I don't know if that's a fair
Pretty
to
swingy.
say.
It's had
It's
a
pretty
lot. It's,
swingy. Okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, what didn't Johnny Wright win with it, or somebody was won with Martell already?
That's why this
2
is
years.
exciting. Yeah.
And
I
three
don't
of
think
us
it's
were on
ever.
that team, I thought.
I don't think it ever. Oh, we did win, didn't
Yes,
we?
Yeah.
half of us were on that
Oh.
team. How can you forget, you bastard?
Yeah, and then it was
Wow.
second 2 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
That was when I was regent there.
And the beauty of it is this war is roughly the same size as the year that Martell won, which to me says this is Martell's best opportunity to win again.
But outside of those 2 years, it's done pretty poorly, right? So is
It didn't do that
just
poorly for me last year.
lies? No, I'm just kidding. What did you get? Did you?
I don't remember. I think
Okay.
it was like 4th place, maybe.
Yeah, top
Okay,
half.
so-
It's still in the top
Well,
half.
you know, I think that it's and that's kind of my point is it just a product? Is that just a product of Martell when Martell's bad, it's a really bad Thrones War faction. Unlike Night's Watch, where sometimes if Night's Watch is not maybe a great faction, it can still support a good Night's Watch team. When Martell is bad, it's just like not only is it tough because you have to find the right team to play it. It's not an
Yeah.
easy
Yeah.
faction to play.
As
you
the
really
teams
have to
scale up, it becomes harder to field average players on Martell as well.
you have to. I mean, I don't want to say you have to innovate more, but it certainly pays to be innovative with Martell. So you know, going into the world's meta, Martell, in my opinion, was the worst house. Is that a fair thing to say? I mean, it was. If it wasn't worst, it was.
It was
next
towards
to it.
the
You're not
bottom.
crazy. You're not
Yeah,
crazy.
it was
So-
towards the bottom.
This restricted list is a huge shot in the arm to Martell.
Yeah.
I mean, I think anybody would be lying if they said anything otherwise. So, you know, if we're saying don't freak out and, you know, sort of look at the world's meta and use that as like a starting block, like certainly Martell has to shift somewhat. It can't be the worst house
Right.
going into this tournament.
Absolutely not.
Even though it has been a historically difficult house to profit from in Thrones War, and it was really bad pretty recently. And so yeah, I think that's one of the more interesting questions for the regents going into this tournament is what's the worst house in this tournament. I don't necessarily think it's Night's Watch. You know, and the other ones that are down there don't inspire me as far as being terrible either, as you know, Baratheon, Tyrell, Greyjoy. Maybe Greyjoy is the worst house.
I have a couple thoughts on Martell.
Okay.
One, I think CT or you already said it. I think if you're going to build a Martell, if you're going to do House Martell, you need to know early because you got to build a team around that. Because getting a player on House Martell that doesn't want to play House Martell is a complete disaster. Whether they incapable of it or just don't want to do it. And then the second thing is I think like maybe I'm wrong, but my perception of Martell is that this is kind of like the player's house. Like this is the Tiffany of the houses in Game of Thrones, where it's supposed to be kind of a high skill, fun, full of tricks faction. And so I think you do find a greater percentage of regents and experienced players that are interested in playing Martell and kind of facing that challenge. So it might get bid up, you know, or I think it's historically probably gotten bid up a little bit more than it should in terms of what they're willing to pay for it. So you're always starting at a little bit of a deficit when you're playing Martell because you probably didn't get a great bargain on it in the first place.
Absolutely. It definitely doesn't help that this year's regent spread are full of people who like Martell, much more than average.
Yeah, that is an interesting wrinkle that like you have to consider is obviously regents have their preferences as well as the players, and so I'm sure trying to basically, I know this is something that everybody does that I've talked to who's been a regent, is they always sort of try to pin, you know, a faction or two onto every regent, and you know, sort of expecting to sort of find their lane more or less of where they're going to be able to get value in the draft. So okay, so
I got two things.
Yeah, go ahead.
My team came in 3rd last year, And in an attempt to steal more points for Griff-indor, Benji Jones just signed up for Thrones War.
Yay!
God damn it, Benji. Yeah, that helps.
Yay! 8,000 points for Gryffindor. This is like whose line? The points don't fucking matter. Just assign a winning, put a W in the Gryffindor column and move forward.
Wait, you think I actually have a whiteboard with Gryffindor and Slytherin on it?
I know you do. Actually, if I
Okay.
didn't have your whiteboard from the testing house, I would automatically assume that you're always sitting in front of a whiteboard.
All right, let me ask my noob question about the worst house, because here's the noob player's perspective. I would have, like you were just talking about Lannister being at the top. I would have been really tempted to put Lannister at the bottom, because
Yeah.
I thought they had like one good deck, and that agenda just got restricted, and they just got Red Keep
Yeah, Red Keep was
restricted.
restricted. Yeah.
So like if you're
Yeah.
counting that as a
Yeah,
top house, is it purely on the basis of wheels within wheels?
it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the swinginess
yeah,
of wheels, right?
It's
That's
Yeah.
speculation based on just how powerful this card is. Like
Like, I think- no. Go ahead.
yeah. You know, I don't know how many decks you guys have built. I haven't built more than a few decks with wheels in it yet. And still, like, I feel, you know, it's strictly speculation, but it feels, you know, pretty okay to speculate on the
Yeah.
power of this fucking card.
And it's like, sure, everybody gets Westeros Bleeds, but consider the fact that Lannister can now play with wheels, and it has another reset in addition to what it was doing before. Especially if we're talking about like Shadows builds. Yeah, like they might be losing the Red Keep, but they're gaining a couple other pretty nasty tricks.
So yeah, so most of my Lannister decks are going to play wheels, and those that can't find a way to abuse that might play Red Keep. But the fact that you can just have outside of plot resets is probably enough to elevate that faction from being the bottom. Is it enough to make it the best house? Probably not. But that's one of those things where if a player drafts that house, if a regent drafts that house and they don't break the format, they could easily be the worst house. So
Yeah.
it's a pretty big risk reward situation there.
So maybe let me talk about like one of my assumptions, and maybe why this particular restricted list breaks that is like as we talked about earlier, when you're evaluating the house, part of what you have to do, you're not evaluating these houses in terms of, you know, I'm going to go play at Worlds with my deck and what are the best decks. You're evaluating these houses in terms of how many decks can I build for my team. And so, you know, this rule about having, you know, every single player gets a different agenda, to me that said, okay, Lannister's going to get hit really hard by that, because, you know, they had one tier 1 deck, and then they had Lanny Crossing, which was, you know, I don't know how you want to 1B, you know, tier 2 or whatever. You know, like that was something that was not working in Lannister's favor already, and now you can only have a single Kingdom of Shadows deck, and you know, and you're gonna have one crossing deck, and then after that, you know, you're starting from scratch. You're starting from scratch where I'm building all these new decks around wheels within wheels, I guess, and so you better be ready for that challenge.
Yeah, but the beauty of it is like in war format, decks like Lanny Crossing have never not been tier 1 and continue to stay tier 1. Even if the meta at large,
but it's one deck. My point is actually just that it's one deck. It's good,
yeah,
but it's just one deck.
But like right now, Lannister looks pretty juicy to me because you could play 2 different Shadows decks. You can play Crossing. You can play the deck that Tom played to the final at Windy City, because that deck
Rose
actually
Banner.
isn't hit. Yeah, that deck was not hit by this restricted list, and that deck was fucking gas. That deck is terrifying.
What's the other Shadows deck that you can play? Assault?
Yeah. I mean, you could just build the same shell. I mean, you change the
You
character.
play HRD, right?
You could also play HRD as well, yeah.
Yeah. I guess, I mean, you lose some of the strength of Shadows in like Nighttime Marauders.
Yeah, you lose character diversity, but
yeah, you lose 2 big parts of that deck. The strength of the Kingdom of Shadows for sure.
But you are gaining these
Nighttime
other
Raiders
tools.
And Bolton Players.
Yeah, you're gaining these other tools that make these really grindy decks potentially excel in their place. So I think it kind of balances out. It's just a different play pattern.
For sure. All right, well, let's move on. We've talked about houses for a bit. Let's talk about player evaluation. So I know, having watched the Second Sons episode that you were on, Trey, in which you guys analyzed the Thrones War draft from last year, you talked a bit about the cost of a win in terms of your budget. Now, does that value stay the same more or less regardless of the number of players in the player pool, or does that value change drastically?
It changes. I don't know if it
Okay,
changes drastically, but yeah, you want
sure.
you it has to.
It
Um,
correlates directly to number of your budget versus the number of available wins.
That's
Is
right.
that
And
correct? Okay.
so like what you're willing like the it's getting into the weeds a little bit here, but yes, what you pay for a marginal win, like already we had to do our house calculation, like how much of our budgets should you be devoting towards house? Everything else is going to be left for players. So that can change just based upon how much we think this group of regents is gonna devote towards house, and how much is, and you can see that different drafts go differently, where we've seen some where only 10% of the total budget went toward houses, and then we've seen some others recently that went up to 20%. So again, like having those numbers allows you to see like, oh, regents are really spending on houses this time. I need to be adjusting my values on players down a little bit, just so that I know like where I'm going to get my value. But yes,
Okay.
it does
So
change.
let's say, we have a value for a win. Like, we have like $2.50 or whatever is what a win costs in this format. I don't know if that's accurate
Hmm.
based on the number of available wins and the budget and all that, but um how do we translate that into something that's actionable, in terms of evaluating players and potential player value?
So yes, we can kind of do the math and come out with something that like $2.55 per win is that's what a win is worth. And then we're going to go back to the whole idea of like, well, what do I get for free, or what do I get for a buck? And I think what I've always assumed is like you generally you don't want to rate any player less than 2 wins. Especially in this format, right? Because it's a Swiss format, so the players that are struggling are going to play against other players who are struggling, and so it's very hard to actually score less than 2 wins in the format. There's going to be some players that do worse than 2 wins, but you would never project that, right? You wouldn't expect that. And so if the idea is, when looking at any player, the first 2 wins are worth $1, then what we're really figuring out is marginal wins. How many wins does a player contribute beyond the first two? And so once you do the math and subtract out the money you've taken out for those first 2 wins from every single player, you've actually like eliminated almost half of the wins, or maybe even more than half of the wins in the entire tournament, by taking out 2 wins per player. And so then you end up with something like $4 or $5 per win past the second. So that's why, you know, if you can project a really elite player to say, well, I would expect Alejandro, for example, to go, you know, to win at least 5 games in this tournament. Most likely he's going to win 6. He's probably going to win a game in the cut. And we're gonna say, and that's like an average performance for him with an average deck. Then you're looking at like Alejandro might be worth 7 wins. What 5 marginal wins at close to $5 a piece. You're still, so we can put a price tag on Alejandro of like $26.
Rip.
Now, will you actually get Alejandro at 26? Probably not. But
Now,
but that's what his wins, an average performance for Alejandro, will be worth in terms of wins.
How does
And that would
Alejandro
be
feel about being $26 or
that
higher?
would be that would be if you were projecting Alejandro to be worth 7 wins. Is that correct?
Like somewhere in the like between six and
Right.
a half
Well,
and
because
seven.
obviously no one's going to be worth 7 wins, but if they're worth 6.5, we're probably rounding that number up, right?
now tell
Is
me,
that
how catastrophic is it for the reason that drafts this hypothetical person, and that person just gets 4 wins?
That person's off the team.
Yeah, it's bad news. Like you've got some risk there. Now that said, Alejandro could give his team 10 or 11. Like when you win on one of these tournaments, then you're talking about tremendous profit. But you would never project somebody to say, I'm projecting this person to win the tournament and I'm going to pay for it in the draft. Like that's certainly a losing strategy there.
Right.
Right.
So maybe the takeaway I would say from that is, like, as far as like my projections on players, um I wouldn't value anybody, project them above like 6.5 wins. Um, in terms of just like an average of what you're going to do. Maybe that's low, but I
That would
think that's
basically be saying like you think the best player in the tournament on average will make the cut with a loss and win one game in the cut. Is that kind of the idea?
that would be 7.
Sure.
If that's an average performance, then
For
you
the
could put,
best player in the tournament.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah,
Eh,
I mean, I think it's fair to say the average for the best player is probably lower than that.
Right,
So
right. I wouldn't
I think your
project
value is
anybody that high. And again, the format works against the best players too, right? Because as you get deeper into the Swiss, you're playing much stronger competition. So you've got a lot of headwind for now. Those wins kind of mean more because you're when you win late in the tournament, you're beating the other team's best players too. So they're crucial, but it also means it's just harder and harder to project somebody to actually, you know, get 6 wins in the Swiss. Like that's a
it,
big number.
it is to some extent, but also um I think if it were just a normal Swiss tournament, you would be guaranteed to be playing a player of equivalent record. Where in this case, it's possible for a team to be doing so poorly that their best player is, you
Hmm.
know, 1 or 2 wins behind you. So there maybe is, maybe that's like super marginal and not relevant, which is probably the case, but it's kind of an interesting nuance.
Yeah, you're right. You've identified this is different than a standard Swiss tournament in that the format will keep, like, it's possible to have more. It's possible to have multiple 7-0 players. Like it's possible in the war format to have 3 7-0 players, whereas a normal Swiss would probably make that impossible.
Yeah. I mean, if they played, I mean, obviously, if the number of players in the tournament was high enough that 7 rounds wouldn't get you to a single undefeated player, that wouldn't be the case. But yeah, I think your point remains. So if we have this idea of a value per win, and we have this idea of sort of like the baseline where everyone starts as worth 2 wins, like a dollar gets you 2 wins. Um, how do you go about assigning a value to a player? I know that you were talking about how Buzz and how Wama would use the jousting pavilion, but what's like what is the process like in sort of getting that to that expected value, getting to that ceiling of what you would spend on a player when you're doing preparation for the event?
Yeah, I think what I would do and have done is just keep this really simple. If you rank the players in terms of how good you think they are from top to bottom, then here's what I have actually in the spreadsheet is I have a curve, right? I've looked at, and should probably go back and look at it again, but like you can go and take a look at a Thrones War tournament or any of these other tournaments and just say, let me look at the results after 7 rounds. Like that's a what kind of curve is that? You have a very even distribution of wins all the way from 0 up to 7, where you have very few at each end and you have a ton of people at 3 and 4. Like you just
Is that
apply
a
that.
bell curve? I don't know.
That's a
I'm not.
Yeah, it's a
Okay.
bell curve. It's a God, forgetting, but like that's what I've already kind of like built into the spreadsheet. Like that curve can alter slightly, but like we know there's going to be maybe we know how many 3-win players there's going to be. We know how many 4-win players they're going to be, and so you can kind of just put a distribution curve there, and then just apply your list to that, right? So if we've got 64 players, and you've got somebody ranked 32, that's very average, you know, and they're probably going to get 3.5 wins, and they're not going to qualify for the cut, right? Like 7 rounds,
Hmm.
3.5 is average. and so you're probably looking at your 32nd best player getting you 3.5 wins. So in that case, you're only paying for 1.5 wins, and so you're looking at about a $6 or $7 player.
Right. Yeah. So and I think that's really great advice. Don't focus too much on assigning this sort of arbitrary expected value. If all things are equal, you take you know a random smattering of players who would go to an event. You're gonna have they're gonna have these sort of like expected results. So I think that's a really interesting way that I had never thought about preparing. Usually, I have in the past done like the tiered system that you mentioned in the beforehand, and it's worked well for me. But I think there's always room to improve, and I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on is you've done so much work, and I think a lot of it's really excellent work on sort of analyzing Thrones War for, as like something that can be sort of improved and something that can be perfected with enough time and effort. So, um, does anybody else have some strong opinions about player valuation? I know CT and Jess. This might be a bit of a hairy topic just because we're drafting on Sunday, but as sort of like more of a general theory sense.
I try to never pay more than $25 for anyone, no matter how good I think they are.
Now that number, surely that value changes based on budget, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
like,
That was like I would say that was like that was kind of like a rule for me and in like the average 9, 10, 11 player range. So like I would be even more reluctant to pay that much in a 7, 8, 9 person field, but we'll see if I have to break my rule.
well, and I know you guys touched on this in the post UK war video, is that to there's not a lot to be gained from the players at the top level. So really, I think where your money is made is in that middle and lower tier.
Yeah.
Obviously, regents are there's a varying skill level usually to regents, which is a whole other issue that we could talk about. It's sort of like that from the starting line, not everybody's got working with the same expected win value, right?
Yeah.
But you know regents, they want certain skilled players on their team for more reasons than just expected wins. There's a leadership element, there's a creativity element, and there's a commitment element to players who have done well in the past. There's a perception that players who do well play more, which is not always the case. But beyond that, I think the results show that really teams win when they draft players um, who exceed their expectations from the middle and the bottom tier. So how do we go about evaluating players in those ranges in order to separate yourself from the rest of the draft? I guess that would be my big question, because I think we talked about how important it is to get as many extra wins out of your house as possible, and I think the next most important, if not the equally important, is to really get as much value as you can out of that middle and lower tier for players. Trey, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, first off, I think CT's thoughts about like there being almost like a cap on the top players is correct. Even as you expand to a much larger number of players, the kind of cap on what you should pay for top players, it inches up a little bit, but not a whole lot. Because if you think about it, it's not like when you get a lot more players in the tournament, suddenly your top player is winning 15 matches. You're still only playing 7 rounds of Swiss before you get into the cut. So like player value in terms of your expectation is pretty capped. And so maybe just as a shorthand here, I would say if you're thinking about spending more than $22 on any player, you are no longer paying for just their wins. You are paying for them to make a contribution to your team in some other way, as a deck builder, as a tester, or something like that. But you're at that point, you're no longer just paying for for wins on that. And then kind of one of the things, like you are kind of just rolling back a little bit here. You are calculating out how many wins are in the entire tournament. Like if we do a tournament with 64 players plus regents, that means there's 252 wins in the round robin, and then another 31 available in the elimination. So that's 297 total auction wins that you're competing for out of your budget. And so you can still like get down to exactly like I should have um you know all of the wins assigned to the player pool here. And by the way, that means I subtract a lot of wins for regent performance. You have to think about, okay, how good are the regents here? Because they're going to eat up a bunch of these wins because they're good players. How many wins are left over for the general player pool here?
That's true. Yeah, a counterpoint to that is that it seems like traditionally regents underperform in the event just because of the does someone have a tornado
Amber
or
alert just went off on my phone.
okay, it's
Okay.
not
Sorry.
we don't have coronavirus alerts yet.
Oh, this is it. This is the end.
Wait, I've got to get some tech support in India because I've got a blue screen right now. So let me hold on. I'm getting out my credit card. No.
So I think traditionally regents sort of underperform, and I think the reason for that is that there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress and a lot of time that goes into the event where you are trying to support and prop up everyone else on the team, and so you end up sometimes being either fatigued or underprepared yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that's an important thing that not a lot of people do, is really figuring out how many wins each regent are going to be basically taking out of the available win pool going into the draft. So if we're going to try to determine, who are the $10 players, who are the $5 players, who are the $2 players that we are interested in, obviously there are resources out there like the Jousting Pavilion, where you can access people's history, but is it not only having that information, but also going back to that idea that Jess mentioned at the beginning of timing and understanding when you can use timing and research to sort of pluck people, for the right price at the right time? Because, if you wait too long for some of these players, their values change drastically. And that's one of the great things about these events and specifically the draft, is that by the end, you may have a player at $2, but by the end, they may be a $6 or $7 player because of how much how much money somebody has left, and they may only have to fill one slot. So how do we account for that in our preparation? Is there an amount of of um like importance that we have to put on timing of like nominating players? Or, and this is really something that I feel like I'm not super proficient on, so I'm interested in hearing what other people have to think about this.
Well, okay. First off, I feel like I'm talking too much here. I've got spreadsheets on
Not at
this. So
all.
when you
That's why
talk
we brought
about
you
like
on.
what do what should somebody be worth? For one thing, I can kind of give out generic spreadsheets so that if like you want to say here's my list of players and just paste it on top of the spreadsheet based upon the number of people in the tournament, like you can do that and say, okay, this so and so is the 38th best player. Trey's spreadsheet says I should pay 6 for them. Like that's step one. And I would say step two is once you're ready to do the auction, you kind of forget about all of this underlying math and you just trust that number for every player and every house you have going forward, and put all the other stuff out of your mind, and you're just looking at that. And when that player that we have down for 6 goes for 10 or 11, you're kind of writing to the side of that, +5. People are overpaying right now, or they're overpaying for second tier players right now. And that helps you just identify current trends in the auction, which I think is what you were getting towards. And
Right.
so having that number is giving you a real good indication of like, where are we in terms of where the region's heads are right now in terms of spending.
So basically, if you were executing the perfect draft, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're having to overspend at the end for a player, or or something along those
I don't want
lines.
to overspend at any time. But
Right,
yeah.
absolutely. But I mean, because sometimes you are put in a position, I've certainly been there, where you just you would rather overspend on the $5 player than be stuck with a player who you've marked as
Yeah, you don't get any. There's no bonus points for finishing the auction with the most money not spent. So if you have one slot to fill and the best player on your list says $5 on it and you have 13, your correct bid is 13. And even then you might want to do some timing because you're worried about that guy that has 14 that's friends with that guy or something. But yeah, there's you and this is a problem that happens to regents all the time. So like maybe one of my Mel Kiper isms right here would be, unlike a lot of other fantasy sports that I've participated in where people tend to go crazy and overspend early, Thrones regents have been pretty conservative, at least in the ones I've watched in the last 2 years. Uh, as Jess was saying, like you may not want to throw out there the thing you want in the first round, but we do actually see sometimes people really blink in the first round when like houses get thrown out and you're like, Targ's at 31, should I bid on this? It's like, if you don't have a number on that, it's real easy to blink, and a house that may be worth 42 goes for 31. And I've seen the general trend is for people to kind of like save their money, and then they find themselves deep in the auction and they want to spend that money, and there's not a single player from the top half left for them to spend to buy with the money they have. So make sure that doesn't happen to you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Well, Jess, CT, do you guys have any sort of closing thoughts on player evaluations, or are you planning on keeping those a little closer to the chest?
I will pretend like I've got a grandmaster plan, but really I just haven't looked super deep into it yet. It's like, I don't know what it is about the pacing of this war, but like, I don't know, I'm just like way behind, and I feel like it doesn't even feel like the draft is 2 days from now, I guess. It's pretty
Well,
wild.
it is.
It is. It definitely is.
So
Luckily,
you're saying that this podcast has been more or less just a big shot in the arm for you, that without it you'd just be completely lost.
it definitely helps. I'm actually super glad we did this for multiple reasons, because also we've been approaching this all very much from like a first time regent basis, which is going to be probably very valuable content for certain other people coming up in War's future. So that's pretty great. And yes,
I don't know what you're talking about.
it'll definitely kick me in the ass to actually make a plan tonight as well. So.
And Trey, do you is this spreadsheet that we continue to reference, is it something that you're willing to that we can link with this video, or are you holding on to that one?
No, it's fine. I mean,
Okay, cool.
the link I've shared with you is assuming that we have 64 players, not including regents, for the event. But it wouldn't be too hard to kind of do versions of that for more or less. And if it ends up being different, I could share that too. But I think we're assuming 64 right now. So if you want to
We're hoping,
share that, you could. And then people really, if they do take this though, they need to be somewhat familiar with spreadsheets and go in and assign win values to every one of these houses, instead of just going with the generic numbers there
right.
that we
Well, and
have.
at the very least, maybe some people who who aren't going to be regents for this event would just like to kind of look and see what kind of goes into preparing for one of these things. If you're really into it, like some of us, like Trey and myself personally. So yeah, I think unless anybody else has something they want to touch on as far as Thrones War preparation, we did have one more little segment that we're gonna do, so to speak. Alejandro, Jess, you guys haven't had a chance to talk in a bit. Just don't want to leave you with the things you wanted to say.
I'm excited for this. So this I was a regent last year, and it probably would have helped me a lot to reach out to Trey, because what I did was not nearly as informative and efficient as this is. But I'm really happy not to be a regent this year and to let other people worry about this part. So
I just think it's going to be really crazy because of the whole restricted list and bin pack cards, and I just don't really know what to expect. So, should be fun.
Yeah, that's fair. All right.
I've got
Trey,
two final
yeah,
tips.
absolutely.
Here's my
Perfect.
advice to regents. I would say, in the end, don't be afraid to spend a few more dollars to get the house that you actually want to play, that you want to be in the cut with. You're playing for yourself and for your team. It's supposed to be fun. So, like, you so often I see people, like you're talking about, Alex, being late in the draft, and you're like, I've got all this money. What should I have spent it on? And you kind of think back and say, well, I really wish I had spent $3 more and gotten the house I wanted. So, you're not going to wreck yourself by spending, $3 or $4 above what you thought in order to get a house that you actually want to play and have a good time with. So don't blink on that. And my second point, which move on. I will come back to my. I had.
No worries. Yeah.
Oh no,
If it comes to
regionality. What we just saw in Thrones War UK, which is maybe something to consider for regions here, is those teams in Thrones War. A lot of them were very regional. Like, this is an area where you can profit by saying, I'm going to draft players that I'm going to be able to get together with, personally, and play test with, and play a bunch of, games with cards. And so I don't think it's a bad idea at all, for Midwest regions to draft Midwest players, and Southern, San Diego regions to draft San Diego players. I think that there's probably a ton of value in that other people aren't even going to be able to compete with.
The problem when the only other person that you could play with is an opposing regent, rip. Since most of the other Midwest players are minimum 3 hours away.
Yeah, big rip. Well, that I have two closing sort of questions. So the first of which is what is and I want to hear everyone's reaction on this. So I'll go around and ask everybody. But what do you think? Would it be a good change, and if so, why? If in the draft, the first 8 nominations were the houses. Trey.
I don't think you need to restrict that. I think I think you see a lot of people playing a lot of games with when they want to bring that up, and so I wouldn't think that would be something that's necessary. And I think it's also good to have a couple of rounds to let people kind of like warm up. Those house decisions are so critical. It might feel like your draft is over in turn 1 if you did it that way. I don't know.
Sure. Perhaps it's not a great idea, but it is something that came up because I know that people have talked about how much different the draft can go if you know what your house is.
So draft a house early. Like, this is on you, Regents. Build your strategy around it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point. So screw everybody else. You don't get the answer. My other question is, do we ever think that we'll one day have a Thrones War event online? And if so, would that be fun?
It'd be fun. It would be a fuck ton of work for whoever organizes it. Like, it would be logistically, I think, a lot more difficult than normal. But it would be pretty great.
True.
Yeah, maybe you could change it up a little bit and let all the teams have different houses. And then make it like nationality based, maybe.
Womp womp. Yeah, it's almost like there's gonna be 2 of those this year already. coming up. That's wild. What a great concept. Who would have thought? This is such a
All right.
popular idea.
Fantastic. 10
I think
points
it's a
for
great
Slytherin.
idea. I think it's a great idea. I mean, World Cup showed that you can have, like, you don't have to have it all in one day, right? You know,
Right.
you could be, round one's going to be over these 3 days, and round two is going to be over these 3 days. And World Cup showed that people can then just schedule their own matches and turn them in. There'll be a lot less drinking.
Yeah, I think
No, there'll be a lot
there-
more drinking. People be in their
Well,
houses.
I think that the World Cup showed that online Iron Throne tournaments are definitely viable. I mean, obviously we've had the online leagues for a long time. I would be interested in seeing if maybe that would be something people were interested in, because unlike the World Cup, you have the element of the draft, which is which is one of the greatest parts about Thrones War, right? Is the Thrones War draft, and you don't have that element in the World Cup. So just an interesting little
You're
thought.
just literally talking about Crasters.
Well, no, because Crafters is happening in person.
Well, sure, but it's whatever. I guess
I'm talking about having a Thrones War online where you had a draft and then, play the games out online.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the World
But,
Cup style with the draft, with everybody basically involved.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you could do like Trey suggested. You could take multiple weeks to finish the event, or you could try to do it all in one day. I don't know. Just some food for thought, especially in the light of the impending pandemic worldwide. Just an idea.
I have a question I want answered by the non-regent members.
Mm-hmm.
The winning house, winning team house, and winning individual house. Predictions. Go.
Alejandro, you go first.
Don't all at once.
Okay, I'm gonna predict that. Wait, you mean you want the region or the faction?
Just which house do you think wins as team, and which house do you think is the individual joust winner house?
I think Targaryen wins, and individual, I think Alex Black wins.
No, I meant house, not person.
God damn it!
You see what you did there? Very nice.
How many points for Gryffindor is that?
100 points for Slytherin.
That's cheating.
Pandering.
No pandering allowed. So wait, are you locking are you locking Alex Black into a house right now? Because you have to pick a house.
Oh, you want the house? Oh, you want the?
Oh, don't try and play it off now like this wasn't some fucking masterful play on your part. Come on. You heard me.
So first I said Targ winning. Wait, team.
But he
team
wants
win
to
or-
know.
Do
He
you
wants
want-
to know
you
the
think-
house of the overall winner.
You think the
ultimately.
joust
Of the-
winner will also be Targ?
Oh.
Or no?
Oh, sorry. Okay. Martell, I think is the house that I would want to play as an individual player.
This
I wanted to
pandering will not stand.
See, I actually
I-
agree with Alejandro as well. So I was curious to
You
hear
would. You would.
I think
interesting.
Targ will be the winning team and Martell will be the winning individual.
I think that it's really hard to not choose Targaryen here. I agree with all the points that you guys have made, but I think I'm going to be slightly contrarian, and I'm going to choose Martell as the overall team winner. I think it's their year, but I am going to choose Lannister as the house in which the eventual champion will be in. I think the most broken Wheels Within Wheels deck will probably be the best deck at the tournament.
Spicy.
That's So I don't necessarily think that house is going to do well as a team, but I think if they manage to draft a handful of players who are really good at deck building and also really skilled, I think that's a good recipe for a potential overall joust winner. So those would be my picks.
All right, I think this question is ridiculous because the whole point of the Thrones War format is that it's an auction, and so if everybody thinks that Targaryen's going to be the winning house, then spend a lot more money on Targaryen.
Yeah.
That is the correct response. Don't let it go for
true.
a little amount of money. I think
Trey,
that it's
Trey
a
outed
legitimate
me.
question.
He outed me trying to get everybody to just bid Targ up to $50.
Well done, great. And I think that those kind of head games are fantastic. I think the question of who's going to win individually, I think that has a lot more value, because now you're treating this like a normal Thrones tournament where you can say, I expect the best deck to come out of Lanny or Targ, and that's all you're really predicting. Because
Yeah.
I would never want to predict these things until I see how people have drafted, and then you can kind of say, I think they overpaid for this or underpaid. Wow, look what this team did.
But
Where
Trey,
they
it's
consistently
more
got
more
cheap
fun
players.
to
That's why
try
I
and
was trying to pick a
influence.
person, not a.
Oh, well, you can pick a person too,
Okay.
but I just want it's fun to
I
try and
already did.
influence people before the drafts with expert opinions, supposedly.
Well, but the Thrones War format is not fair. Like in the sense that, like, if you're an excellent player, like, if you're at the top of the draft list, which I think, Alejandro and Alex, will be in this, your chances of playing a weak faction go up dramatically. If you're paying for, if we're just hypothetically, Targ is the best house, or you think Lanny is going to produce the champion, like, people should have to spend a lot of money for that house, which means there's a lot less money to spend for Alejandro and Alex. So it's just much more likely that the top players end up being on a weak faction. So it's harder
So
to
what
even
you're just
predict
saying is I need to convince a regent to spend all their money on me and the faction that I want to play.
and then $1 players on everybody else. Yep.
Yeah.
That's probably not a winning. It's probably a good strategy for
Hmm.
Alejandro, not so good for the regent.
Hmm.
But the regent does get to play the good house.
Yeah, what if
right?
the regent's pretty
Yeah.
good too, and they're just a bastard and decide that just them and Alejandro are going to do well.
That's
Hmm.
legit.
CT, let's have a little conversation.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Good stuff. Great stuff.
Great
All
stuff.
right, so I do want to get to our last little segment here, and firstly, I want to thank Trey again for coming on.
Does this mean I don't get to talk in that segment?
No, you absolutely, you
Oh,
absolutely get to talk.
I will
You
mute
got-
this guy's mic.
You got glazered for the last segment. Damn.
But
Whoa.
but we are sort of oh, there we
No.
are. We are sort of moving out of the segment in which
In which I know anything. Yeah. Okay.
in which we requested you to come on to
Which
share
you're
your
the
expertise.
expert.
But next, I wanted to talk briefly about the conclave, which is the vote for the big.
Is this another Mike Bloomberg ad? Is that what's happening here?
This is no. This is not a. This is not a Mike Bloomberg ad. This is I don't know what this is.
What are you
This is
talking
like
about? Conclave isn't going to win Thrones War.
I think this is like a Vern Troyer ad, or what's the name of the guy who like puts his boot on his head in New York State, and he always runs for president? You guys, and nobody else know who this person is?
You're on your own.
I'm not familiar.
Okay. All right, yeah.
Is that,
Anyway,
oh fuck, what's his name? No, I know who you're
look it up.
talking about now.
It's not Vern, but it's a weird name. Anyway.
Is it the naked cowboy?
So we got somebody on this cast who is going to be running for the Maester of Design, and we have somebody else on this cast who is running for Maester of Jess. Remind me, what are you running for?
Maester
America's
of
in
Jess.
communication.
America's in Communications. So I just wanted to give these two a platform to talk about the upcoming election and sort of like what their platform is and what they
Free
what
media,
they wanna
big
do.
advantage.
Woo.
Absolutely. Free press. It pays to be member of the cast, I suppose. So Jess, why don't you start us off? What some of the why should we vote why am I going to vote for you, Jess? Tell me.
Because if you don't, you're dead to me. Oh my god, the music! I can't. Okay.
Well,
Obviously-
firstly, what are the responsibilities of those two maester roles? I mean, because not everybody knows.
Yeah. So the Maester of America is kind of just like is the voice for North and South America, like the player's voice within the conclave. That's kind of how I've understood it. I know that these roles are not really like we don't know exactly how it will work out, I guess, for like the Maesters of America and Europe and Asia Pacific. But
I think your role will be to find a new place on the moon where we can live when the coronavirus has ravaged our country.
yeah. So that would be
Insert coughing
my
sound.
first thing. Find new planet. Okay.
Think
And then
big.
the communication role is just like a community outreach type role, keeping the community updated on things, marketing, that kind of thing.
And that's a really big one because as we've seen, I envision some of that being like what the role that Matt Holland had been filling for the last however long that his presence on social media has existed. And the difference in interaction between, those who are creating the game and those who are playing the game, from the time when Holland's existence, to the time when he wasn't around, I think was pretty drastic in terms of, being like a positive influence on the game. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Thrones players, I mean, we just want to know what's going on, right? So these roles, I feel like, just let people know what's going on, especially communications. And then the Americas, it's more of, I feel like it would be more of a role of like, what things do you like? What things do you not like? Concerns, ideas you have, like, that you want brought up to these certain departments.
gotcha.
Would you say that as former team captain of Team America, you are qualified to fill in this role?
I would say I am, yes. I don't have a ton of contacts with South America, which is kind of one of the things, but I'm definitely willing to find out where that community is. It seems like a lot of them are on the Discord. Obviously, for the World Cup, I did have to communicate with those team captains. So, I mean, for the Americas position, I'm definitely looking at like building a team of basically like little birds throughout North and South America
Doesn't sound sinister at all.
to feed me information like on what the players want. So,
Right on. All right, CT, you're up for Maester of Design. Why should I vote for you, you piece of shit?
Because you told me to, Drill Sergeant. So basically, I don't know if you realize this. There's a lot of really enthusiastic designers in this community. And that's great because I do feel like this position is so highly contested and the people who are gunning for it are so passionate, and that's great because we are going to need that. The important thing is being the person who can funnel all that creative energy into something that will work for this game long term for years. And basically, I have been keeping dead card games alive like my entire life. It's just a thing that us Chris's do. So I'm just, I mean, I've pretty exhaustively. I mean, you can read my manifesto or whatever online, and it's like pretty exhaustive. So I've said a lot of it there. I don't want to just kind of like rehash everything here, and because we'll be here for another 2 hours. But like, check that out if you kind of want to see what my game plan would be. And I'm just like super excited that there's just so much interest in it. But I think I have a lot of the experience that's required for this. I think that I'm good at receiving criticism well, which this job will be heaps and heaps of having to deal with kind of community backlash and all the worst parts of what we give FFG on a daily basis. So as one who dishes it out and can also take it, I am ready to make this work for this game so that we have like more cool cards, more creative direction and design. Just take the game somewhere, like take the game places where it hasn't been yet, so we're not just getting like one new mechanic every 2 cycles, and like if that mechanic fails, we're all just kind of like sitting around just going, okay, here's the 5 new cards that are great for the metagame or impactful for the metagame, and here's 6 cards I'm putting in my binder. I just want to break the cycle of kind of where Thrones has been up to this point.
Awesome. Well, Alejandro or Trey, we got this opportunity to have these candidates here with us. Do you have any questions for either of the candidates?
I do.
Yes.
Go ahead, Alejandro.
Oh no, go ahead. You can start it.
Okay, so Master of Design, what is your plan, or is there a plan? What is the role of the community in submitting or weighing in on new cards in this kind of new environment in which we're at?
So basically, I do think that having like an open Discord or a Google Doc or something where we can just like constantly take feedback from the community about what they think is working or not working with the game is important. So I would definitely encourage like submissions
Can
from
I
that.
submit card designs? Damn it!
You can. You
Can I submit
absolutely
card
can.
designs?
Sure. Like
Do people get to see them?
absolutely. So like unlike a company like FFG where we're just like stretched thin and we have X amount of projects and we have to make a bottom dollar, the thing that like a players committee does is like we're just doing this because we want the game to be better and we're volunteering our time for it. There's literally no reason that if anyone has an idea that it shouldn't go through my inbox at some point and be read. I think that that's a service that we provide as a players community that's a huge boon over us being ran by a corporation, which is a pretty big deal. The other thing is like the manpower will be way bigger. Like we will have to build a design team. There's going to be 6, 7, I don't know how many like we're kind of looking at, but like I wouldn't be surprised if it was like a half a dozen like design people in their own with their own kind of groups that also funnel down into playtesting. There will be playtest heads. Those people will have their own groups. We're going to be able to like compile more data than FFG was ever able to put together like with their resources because, you know, they have X amount of projects. We're just playing one card game and we have hundreds of volunteers at our disposal. When we did the volunteer call a while back, like we had so many submissions and so many of those people are so passionate to contribute something to the game, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I was looking at that. It's like it is definitely going to be a very political job. You know, like both in terms of like you said, receiving criticism, communicating with the community. Um, you know, I think my thoughts on design would be like this has got to be a person that is going to manage that process. This is not necessarily about like being an auteur who has a vision for the game necessarily, but is rather going to, you know, bring the community in, and at the same time you still got to deliver content on a really tough schedule. So like this is the toughest position out there. So but I've reviewed the cards you sent me, and there was some fantastic stuff there. So I was really impressed. And if people haven't checked out, what did you call it? Your manifesto? If people haven't checked out the manifesto,
Yeah, it's like a
I
design
think they
journal
should.
/ manifesto, whatever you want to call it. Like it's something I've just kind of been slowly building on since like basically the day we came home from nationals, like the whole car ride back, I was just like, we have to start a plan. Like when they said like we're not doing any more product, we've done all the design space we can do. Like my 8-hour rant in the car home about how that was complete bullshit basically turned into this kind of like you call it a manifesto. Like that works really well, I think.
And we will be linking that with the episode so that people who haven't had a chance to look at it do. Alejandro, I know you had a Trey. Was that all? I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
I'm put in. I think that the two roles that Jessica has identified there both involve, you know, communicating with the community, both, you know, giving, you know, being communicating with the community so they know what's going on, but also listening to people and channeling that feedback into what the conclave should be doing. And I think she's would be great for either of those roles. And how's my endorsement?
Awesome.
Yay, thank you.
Alejandro, you had a couple questions?
Could you tell me about your best Dothraki card that you plan on designing one?
Is this a question for Jess or for CT?
No.
That was for Jess, clearly.
Okay, Dothraki.
Yeah, clearly.
Army.
Yeah. Jess, how
Free to
how
play.
available are you to bug the future Maester of Design? through Dothraki?
Army, free to play. All right,
Sold!
we are cooking with gas.
Like I said, Alejandro, I will look at everything in the inbox once, and then it will either go to put this up to one of the other design people to work on, or put it in the trash. I assume you.
So you're saying there's a chance?
Tough but fair.
So you're telling me there's a chance? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what the job is, right? It's going to be tough but fair. It's going to be assessing a global community's outlook on where the design of the game should be, and like trying to push people's ideas up. But at the end of the day, somebody has to be like, this is going to work, this is not going to work, this is what we're going with, etc., etc. It's going to be a hard, like you said, it's going to be a thankless, difficult job. I think people should consider that. And it will be a very political job, and I think I have very good ties with most of the people in the community. I'm very approachable. I mean, vote for me, dog.
Dog?
Dog.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, I think that is going to conclude this episode of Zero Reserve. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and thanks for everybody who's been on the cast. Trey, this is, I guess, your opportunity. If you've got anything you want to plug right now, feel free.
Everybody subscribe to the Game Brain podcast. I'm a co-host on that. It's a board game podcast available everywhere you'll find podcasts. Game Brain podcast.
I am a subscriber. It's a great podcast. I highly recommend it.
Yeah, we'll have to link it in the
Oh, absolutely, we will.
Quote unquote show
links
notes.
in the description.
In the video, because nobody's gonna listen. 2 hours in the episode, Trey, you should have brought this up an hour and 45 minutes ago. Really.
I'm fine. I'm good.
That's immediately what you should have said after say hey, Trey.
Was find me on Game Brain.
I got to get that one subscriber at the beginning, is what you're saying.
Oh yeah, more. We're getting more than that. Put in the bank 3 subscribers for Game Brain after
All
this
right,
episode.
I'll track it.
Yeah, track it. All right, everybody. Well, this is going to be it for Zero Reserve, and don't forget to check your reserve. I don't know. I'm not sure. Anyway, goodbye.
Ow!
This ad was brought to you by Mike Bloomberg.